Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to piece together a story, an absolutely fascinating and, often overlooked chapter of history. We're talking about the evidence for an African discovery of America, way, way before Columbus ever set sail.
When you ask this question, we're all taught one name, right? But the actual historical evidence, some of it has been hiding in plain sight for centuries, tells a totally different story. It's way more complex and, honestly, pretty surprising. It really makes you ask, okay, not just who got here first, but when did they arrive, and what did those first encounters even look like?
So yeah, that's the big, bold claim we're digging into today. And listen, this isn't just some provocative statement to get your attention. It's a conclusion, and it's drawn from a whole bunch of different lines of evidence. And some of that evidence comes from sources that are going to absolutely surprise you. All of it points to one thing. Explorers from Africa reached the Americas long before anyone else.
All right, let's get right into the evidence. And we're going to start with a source you would probably never expect. The words of Christopher Columbus himself, right from his own journals. Okay, so picture this. It's Columbus's second voyage. He's in Hispaniola, and the indigenous people there tell him this incredible story. They said, hey, we've had visitors before, and they described them as black-skinned people who came in these huge boats, and they were carrying spears tipped with gold? And it gets better. The natives actually had a specific name for the metal on those spearheads. They called it guanin. Now remember that name, because guanin turns out to be this massive clue, a direct link between the Caribbean and West Africa.
Okay, and this is where it gets really, really interesting. Columbus takes these spear tips, sends them back to Spain to be analyzed. And what do they find? The composition, 18 parts gold, 6 parts silver, 8 parts copper. It's a perfect match for an alloy that was also called guanin in West Africa. Think about that. The name is identical. The chemical formula is identical. That's not a coincidence.
But look, the evidence doesn't just stop with some fancy metal. The trail of clues keeps going, and it leads us into a couple of different worlds. Botany, the study of plants, and language. And this is where we start to see even more connections popping up between West Africa and the Americas before Columbus. So, botanists have found all these plants that are native to Africa, but they were being grown, cultivated in the Americas way before 1492. And if you look at this list, we're talking about things like yams, plantains, even cotton. These aren't just seeds that blew across the ocean. No way. Their presence means somebody had to have brought them across the Atlantic on purpose.
And the plantain, specifically, is kind of the botanical smoking gun here. Why? Well, it's pretty simple. Unlike something like a coconut, plantain seeds can't just float in salt water for months and survive. They would die. So the only way for them to get across the ocean is if people brought them in a boat. It's a point botanists have been making for centuries, actually.
Then you've got the language clues. So back in the 1920s, this linguist from Harvard, Leo Wiener, he starts looking at place names in the Americas, and he notices something funny. A lot of them sounded distinctly African. Take Guanahani, for example. That was the native name for the very first island Columbus landed on. Well, it turns out that word has clear linguistic roots in West African languages. Okay, so you've got the metal, the plants, the words. All this evidence starts to pile up, but it all leads to one massive critical question, right? Was the journey even possible? How could ancient mariners have crossed the huge, vast Atlantic Ocean? Well, the evidence says absolutely it was possible. And not only was it possible, but West Africans had this really sophisticated, long-standing tradition of sailing and exploring the seas. This whole idea that they were just stuck on their continent, that's really just a modern misconception. And we know this because we have the proof. We've got evidence from ancient art, from pottery, from later accounts by Europeans, all showing a whole variety of seaworthy African boats. And we're not talking about little dinghies. We're talking everything from giant papyrus rafts to these huge dugout canoes that could hold up to 80 men. These were vessels that were absolutely equipped for a serious ocean voyage.
And get this, we even have historical accounts of them doing it. In the year 1311, that's more than 150 years before Columbus, mind you, the emperor of the Mali Empire supposedly sent out a massive fleet. We're talking 200 ships, and he sent them west, out into the Atlantic, with one simple command. Find the edge of the ocean, and don't come back until you do.
And here's the kicker. They wouldn't have even been fighting the ocean. There are these incredibly powerful ocean currents, the Canary and Equatorial currents, that create a natural circular conveyor belt. It literally flows from West Africa, pushes you straight to the Americas, and then circles back again. It's like nature built a highway right across the Atlantic for them.
Okay, so all of that brings us to what might be the most dramatic, the most, well, unshakable physical evidence of all. We're talking about artifacts carved in stone, things you can still go and see, and even touch to this day. Down in southeastern Mexico, archaeologists dug up something that is just impossible to ignore. This isn't a little piece of pottery, it's not a plant, it's something on a truly epic, monumental scale.
18. Just let that number sink in. 18 of these incredible artifacts have been found, all scattered across the ancient homeland of the Olmec people. Now, if you're not familiar with them, the Olmec were the first major civilization in Mesoamerica, what we now call Mexico and Central America, the mother culture, basically.
They are the Olmec colossal heads. And when I say colossal, I mean it. These are massive sculptures, some of them weighing up to 50 tons. And here's the crucial detail. Every single one of them is positioned to face east. They're all looking out, right across the Atlantic Ocean.
So let's break this down. First, these things are ancient. They date back to at least 900 BCE. Now, you don't carve a 50-ton statue of just anybody, right? The sheer effort means these had to be incredibly important people. Kings, rulers, maybe even gods. And here's the thing. The archaeologist who first discovered them, he himself noted that their facial features, well, they look unmistakably African. These are revered figures, immortalized in stone for everyone to see.
So let's just recap for a second. We have clues in Columbus's own diary, we have plants, we have language, and we have these giant stone heads. If all this evidence exists, you have to ask, why isn't this story more widely known? Why do our history books still pretty much start the clock in 1492?
Well, for one thing, let's just look at a map. Simple geography. The journey from West Africa to Brazil is less than half the distance that Columbus had to sail to get to the Caribbean. So the voyage wasn't just possible, it was actually a whole lot shorter and easier.
So why do we still cling to that 1492 narrative? Well, there are a few big reasons. For starters, you've got simple textbook bias. For a long time, this evidence just wasn't included. Then there's the fact that a big dramatic story of conquest is just, well, it's a more compelling narrative for some than a story about centuries of peaceful trade. But the most tragic reason? The catastrophic loss of the indigenous population. Within just a few years of Columbus arriving, up to 90% of them were gone. And with them, their oral histories, their memories, all of it was erased. It created this huge historical vacuum, which was then filled by just one story, the European one.
So when you put it all together, the evidence really suggests that Columbus wasn't the first to discover America, he might have just been the last. And look, this doesn't mean we erase him from history, of course not, but it does place him in a much longer, richer, and more complex story of global connection. And it leaves us with a really powerful question to think about. If a story this big was overlooked for so long, what other incredible stories are still out there just waiting for us to find them?